Okay. So I'm here with Noam Chomsky in his office, and since it's kind of late, we'll get right into things.
Good.
Now, you've said it's the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies, correct?
Responsibility of anyone. Intellectuals even more so, because intellectuals are just people with more privilege and opportunity.
Okay. Now, do you think there are enough intellectuals doing this these days?
That's not, well, the phrase responsibility of intellectuals in the article you're referring to was actually double-edged. I talked about their ideal responsibility, which is like everyone's, to try to find out the truth, to be independent, to speak the truth if you can find it out, or your best guess. That's everyone's responsibility. Intellectuals, who are intellectuals? They're just people who have more privilege and opportunity and training and background and resources and so on. So with that privilege comes responsibility. You have more opportunity, therefore you should do it more. That's the ideal responsibility. The actual responsibility in just about every society that I know of, far back as you can go, is to be servants of power. That's the primary task of the respected intellectuals in just about every society. It's hard to find an exception.
When you say servants of power, you mean that they assist those who are in power, they advise them?
They both advise them, they give justifications for them, they develop intellectual constructions that support them. Notions like, say, you can't read an article about foreign affairs in the press or in journals or whatever without it's talking about how the U.S. is dedicated to bringing democracy to the world. That's a catechism. You have to say that. Is it true? Does anybody try to demonstrate it? If you try to demonstrate it, what do you find? What you find is the opposite. Like every other power system, the U.S. is frightened of democracy, U.S. government, at home and abroad. But if you say that, you're not within the cadre of respectable intellectuals. And as I say, this is not specifically true of the United States. I think this is quite general. That goes as far back in history as you can check it. Well, it's not 100%, like every society has a fringe of dissidents who don't accept these rules. And pretty standardly, they're treated badly. How badly depends on the nature of the society.
Okay. Now, this is, I guess the next question is somewhat related to this. In your book, American Power and the New Mandarins, there's a quote about universities, and it says that they've failed to form an effective counterweight to the military-industrial complex.
Did I use the phrase military-industrial?
I think you were quoting Senator Fulbright.
No, I may have been quoting somebody, yeah.
I'm not sure whether you were using...
Yeah, that sounds like his quote, yeah. I was quoting him, I think.
Okay, so were you using it...
Well, he may have referred to the military-industrial complex. I usually don't use the phrase.
Well, he was talking about universities, he said, joining the monolith, adding greatly to its power and influence. I don't know if he meant that as a criticism.
Well, I think I was quoting his opinion. And I think there's some truth to it. I wouldn't put it that way myself exactly.
Okay. Do you think, now he was saying this back in the 60s, I presume, has this changed for the better, for the worse? Is it about the same?
If you change the phrase military and industrial system to the dominant system of power, which includes the military, includes industry, since the 1970s, it includes increasingly and by now overwhelmingly financial institutions, includes the propaganda, the public relations system, the media, this whole complex of power, then by and large universities participate in it, as you'd expect.
And it pretty much hasn't changed that much then?
There have been changes. There's a lot more changes in a lot of directions. So the 1960s had a big effect. They led to a lot more freedom and independence in the universities. Students are much more open and challenging and questioning today than they were, say, 50 years ago. The universities have changed in other ways. So it takes you take a walk down MIT, it's half women, third minorities, informal relations, informal dress. That wasn't true at all when I got here in the 1950s. There was white, obedient males doing the well-dressed, doing the homework. So that's a big change. And there's been a reaction to it. So in the early 70s, there was a lot of concern in elite circles that students were becoming too independent, too free. In fact, that there's too much democracy altogether. That normally passive, apathetic parts of the population are becoming stirred up, pressing for their demands and so on. And there's a lot of reaction to it all across the spectrum, so-called liberals to conservatives. And a lot of repression was introduced to try to beat it back. It's a constant battle. Whenever there are steps towards freedom and independence, power systems are going to resist in one or another way, try to control it, co-opt it, modify it, repress it if they can.
Okay, now one of the things that you talk about, you're often critical of mainstream media, I think primarily because they tend to show a very narrow spectrum of views, often ignoring views from, for example, from the left. Now, the one thing that I've heard you also say is you refer to the U.S. as the freest country in the world. Now, on the one hand, you have this mainstream media that seems to be restricting access or the ability of people to voice their opinions in some sort of a more open form. And on the other hand, you're referring to the U.S. as the freest country in the world.
Well, freedom has a lot of dimensions. And there are dimensions in which the U.S. is maybe the freest country in the world, important ones. So, for example, protection of freedom of speech is a very significant right. And the U.S., I think, is preeminent or close to it in that, despite the fact that there's huge industries devoted to controlling opinion. That's not inconsistent. In fact, they're related. It's because there is so much freedom of speech that there are massive efforts to control it. And it's kind of striking that the public relations industry, which is basically a propaganda industry, that developed in the two freest countries in the world, the United States and England. And for the same reason, business elites and others recognized that enough freedom had been won so they couldn't control the population by force. So you have to turn to an alternative control of attitudes and opinions. And you develop these huge propaganda industries, which the Nazis emulated, the Bolsheviks tried to emulate, but they were clumsy.
So then you're kind of saying that it's this quality of freedom that's perhaps produced this narrow...
It didn't produce, no.
It has some sort of a connection to it.
I mean, when people become too free and independent, they're going to threaten systems of concentrated power who will typically try to find ways to react. How they'll react depends on the society. I mean, some societies they'll react by mowing everyone down in the streets. Others they'll react by putting them in jail. Others they'll react by controlling opinion and attitudes, and in other ways. Okay. In fact, one of the reasons for the massive effort in the United States to induce consumerism, I mean, a huge amount of energy and effort goes into turning people into consumerist fanatics. A large part of that is his effort to control people and keep them away from decision making, and it's pretty conscious if you look at the business literature. Okay. There's something a little different here. Well, you're strongly associated with libertarian socialism, with anarcho-syndicalism. But one thing that I find interesting is that you call yourself one of the few conservatives in the United States because, as you say, you actually believe in traditional values. Now,
And I'm just doing this for the sake of clarity. When you say conservative, what do you mean by this?
Well, the term conservative now doesn't mean anything like what it
I
actually
realize
meant,
it's been used in many different ways.
It
It
means
almost
reactionary
has.
status. So take, say, Reagan, who's supposed to be the ideal of the conservatives. He believed in a very powerful state which intervened massively in the economy. He was by far the most protectionist American president in post-war history. He believed in violence and repression. I mean, that's called conservative. Any genuine conservative would turn over in his grave at that. The term conservative used to mean something like classical liberal. A person who believed in classical liberal values of the Enlightenment, the values of Adam Smith, David Hume, and others. And I think there's a lot. I don't agree with them on everything, but I think there's a lot of value in those views, in the Enlightenment conceptions.
So there's no.
And in fact, I think in many ways, a lot of the anarchist movement, including the anarcho-syndicalist wing of it, grew out of these classical liberal ideals. That's not my original view, incidentally. One of the leading anarcho-syndicalist thinkers, Rudolf Rocker, pointed out, I think with some plausibility, that as he put it, classical liberalism was destroyed when it was kind of dashed against the rocks of capitalism, which undermined it. And anarchism is a natural outcome of that, which tries to capture the fundamental ideals and realize them in a modern society. It's complex, but I think there's something to that. It's kind of interesting, if you go back a century, when the courts were beginning to provide extraordinary rights to corporations, like the right of personhood, which is a big issue now. It's in the courts about a century ago. It was condemned by conservatives and supported by progressives. It was condemned by conservatives because they regarded it as an attack on the fundamental principles of classical liberalism and the Enlightenment, namely that rights inhere in human beings, not organic entities created by state power. Progressives, incidentally, supported it.
They supported
the personal rights of corporations. They supported granting corporations more rights, overwhelmingly. Not just this is not drawing the lines too starkly, but substantially.
Okay, so when you're using the term conservative, you're talking about an older kind of conservatism.
What the word traditionally meant,
Okay, well,
I'm not talking about Rand Paul, or whatever his name is, Paul Ryan.
You mean Ron Paul?
No, I wasn't mentioning the other guy, Paul Ryan, who's called a conservative. I'm not talking about him. I'm not talking about Gingrich. I'm not talking about Reagan. I'm not talking about Fox News. These are not conservatives in any traditional sense. They're radical statists.
Okay, this brings me to another thing, and you've often talked about how in the United States, for example, words like libertarian have a completely different meaning from what it would be in Europe. Some people in the United States say that there's a contradiction in saying libertarian and socialism because they don't go together, but you disagree with this.
People can pick what words they want, but there's a traditional phrase, libertarian socialism, which referred to anarchy.
No, but what's interesting is, on the one hand, you have this kind of thinking that exists in the modern day U.S., but then I noticed that you like talking about, in the mid-19th century, the factory girls. You say that they had a rich and interesting culture. You also refer to the press of that period as being very free and lively.
I think that was the period of the freest press in the United States.
And these two things, I imagine, these factory girls and this free and lively press, to some extent, I think, embody some of the libertarian values that you talk about.
These were people, not just the factory girls, but the Irish artisans who went into the mills and so on. They were bitterly opposed to the industrial system that was being imposed on them, and part of the reason was it was taking away their Republican rights, their rights as citizens of a free republic. It was also destroying their culture, and they were quite bitter about it. They were also bitter about the kind of one of the most striking phrases that showed up, I think, was their opposition to what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Sort of Ayn Rand, That's what they were opposed to in 1850. That was the new spirit of the age at the time. And for 150 years, there's been a massive effort to try to turn people into a kind of savages who'll accept this new spirit. And it's still going on right in front of our eyes.
Well, I guess you've partly answered another question that I have, in that looking at things like the Factory Girls and this free and lively press from the mid-19th century, they seem very remote from the modern day U.S.
I'm not so convinced of that. I mean, I think maybe people. I think these concepts that are expressed in the independent press of the 19th century are just below the surface, and they come out very easily, constantly. So, for example, right now there's, right near Boston, for example, about a year ago, there's a manufacturing enterprise, not a huge one, but a successful one, which manufactured sophisticated equipment for aircraft, and it's owned by a multinational. The multinational wanted to close it down because maybe it wasn't making enough profit for them or something. The workers, through the union, wanted to buy it, purchase it, take it over, run it themselves. I think it's a very natural idea. That's exactly what you read about in the 19th century press. Those who work in the mills should own them. And I think it's perfectly understandable today. The multinational wouldn't let them do it, probably for class reasons. I think they lost money by closing it down. But this effort to try to develop self-owned, self-managed enterprises is spreading all over the country. And I think it's a very natural one. It could grow into something very substantial.
Okay. So now, one of the things, and I guess this is somewhat related to what you were just saying, these things are just under the surface. You've talked about how libertarian socialism will contribute to a spiritual transformation, or to enable people to act, to decide, to create, to produce, to inquire.
That's what its basic values are.
And you've cited two large-scale examples, one being the Israeli kibbutzim, and another one being the Spanish Revolution in 1936 before it was crushed. Now, it seems like maybe in the last century there have been very few large-scale libertarian socialist revolutions. Are people averse to such a thing, or?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure it's true. Happens constantly in different forms. So, for example, right here in the United States, there's a substantial growth of cooperatives, self-owned enterprises. Actually, an interesting book about it that just came out by Gar Alperovitz, who's been working on these for a long time, mostly in the Ohio area. And a lot is happening, small scale, but it's growing. And I think these things are always popping up all over. And there's a huge one in Spain, Mondragon. It's worker-owned, it's not worker-managed. But it's a huge enterprise with industries, banks, agriculture, and so on, housing. And that's not my ideal. It's not worker-managed. It lives in a capitalist environment, but it's worker-owned and quite successful.
Okay. And I guess this is a bit timely because we're looking at all of these protests going on. I just saw one outside of Harvard, the Occupy protests. Now, you talk about movements, and one thing that I found interesting was I watched the documentary Manufacturing Consent, and at the time that it came out, you stated that you were ambivalent about people's reaction to it, that their reaction was, how do I join the movement? Or
when I got Well, there's no movement there. It was just, you know.
Well, I understand
yeah.
that, but it was interesting because I also saw an interview recently that you did in Norway, and somebody asked you, just in general, what libertarian socialists should be doing, and you said create real libertarian socialist
Yeah, I
movements.
think they should, but that's what I meant at that time too. When people asked to join the movement, if I remember, I was responding to their misconception that there was a movement, and I was somehow, you know, maybe leading it or part of it or something. And there wasn't. There was just an opinion. You can't join the movement until it's there. You have to form the movement.
And so you're really telling people don't
Follow anyone.
don't follow, try
Organize.
and do things on your own.
Create
some kind
the
of
movement,
yourself.
like the Occupy movements are doing. I think they're doing a very good job of actually creating popular movements and creating communities. I mean, most of the participants in these movements are people who they grew up in a very atomized, isolated society, which you really don't have interactions with other people, cooperative interactions. But they're creating associations, they're building communities, they're working together. It's kind of striking to me that one of the first things that the repressive forces do when they go after them is destroy the library, free library. We don't allow that around, so go after the public library, destroy the books, destroy the kitchen. It's a cooperative kitchen, everybody's working there, everybody's getting fed, we don't want that. And so get rid of all those things, all the elements of a lively, functioning, free community. Those are threatening. Destruction of the libraries is pretty striking. We remember people who destroyed libraries, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good then.
Yeah.
Well, then, thank you very much for meeting me. I
Okay.
realize it's late and I appreciate it. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks for sticking
Thank
around
you.
all day. Don't tell Viv.